Hello?
Hi, this is Joe Hills. I'm here.
My name is Anna Thorpe. I'm with the Wellston Tenant Association.
Why, good afternoon, ma'am.
This is Connie Lasker, North Little Rock Resident Council.
Helen Surratt, Little Rock, Cloverdale Estates Resident Council.
Hello.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
I'm so glad
Hi,
you're back.
We'll go back. We'll go.
It's just gonna take time,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that we are, I'm glad we're doing it now.
No.
Well, when Barb mentioned about karaoke, I said to her, that wouldn't be sanitary, everybody holding the mic, but she brought up, you could always have a handy wipe in between.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Oh, okay. Shit. Excuse me. I got a hashtag or what?
You entered invalid. You entered 3040386.
Oh, I see. Wrong damn number. Oh, fine. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is JoAnn Rodriguez, the presenter. If I can have everyone mute your phones during the presentation, that would be most helpful. So if you have a telephone or if you're on the computer, if you could just mute yourself. Today, are you able to mute everyone automatically?
That's the only thing I know. That's about it.
We can mute everybody. All right, JoAnn, you're unmuted.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn my webcam on. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Resident Rights After RAD. I want to make sure that I go through a few things before we get started. I want everyone to know that there is a chat feature that is a little bubble that looks like a little text box. That's part of the GoToMeeting feature. And if you're able to, during the presentation, if you have questions, rather than unmuting yourself, go ahead and use the chat feature. Usually the chat would pop up and I'll be able to see the questions, and I'll try to address the questions as we go along. We will have questions at the end as well, in which will allow you to unmute yourself at that time. But if we can just be conscientious of that there are many people on this call and on this training, and in order for us to be really respectful of other people, we want to just make sure that you're muted during the entire presentation. But please feel free to use the chat feature on the side, and we look forward to having this presentation with you. So it is 2:04. We do have quite a few participants, so welcome. We are so excited that you're here. We are going to get started. And so everyone, if you're on the computer, you should be able to see a screen that says Resident Rights After RAD. If you're unable to see anything on the computer, just go ahead and send it via the chat. And today, Charles, who is with BGC Advantage, she's moderating, and she can also see the chat and perhaps help you. If you are on the telephone, we did send out the PowerPoint prior to, so hopefully you'll be able to take a look through it. If you are just joining us and you haven't received it, then just let us know and we'll make sure that we get this information to you as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's session is Resident Rights After RAD. It is being presented by myself. I'm JoAnn Rodriguez. I work with BGC Advantage. Okay, BGC Advantage is a development group. We are both developers, consultants, and partners. We work mostly in the South, but we have properties in Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. We're working in Florida as well. We're working in Oklahoma, in Texas, and we are in what we call inspired development. Our core values include integrity, innovation, investment, and inspiration. If you want to know more about us, by all means, please go to the BGC Advantage website. You'll have a lot of resources and information, as well as you have the ability to request additional training. So if you like what you see today and you want additional training on different topics, we have a slew of experts that work with BGC. We can help you with almost all of your training needs, and particularly when we're talking about RAD, when we're talking about HUD issues. So please feel free to go onto our website, find out a little bit more about us, and let us know what we can help you with. So today we're going to talk about resident rights, and our agenda is going to follow very loosely what is RAD, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, what are residents' rights after RAD, organizing activities, what is the resident council, what is the Resident Advisory Board, which we call RAB. So there's a lot of acronyms, and that's just something that we know with HUD, and just all of us that have worked with HUD for a long time, we're just familiar with it. So if I use an acronym, I apologize ahead of time. I try not to use acronyms in training sessions, but feel free to say in the chat line, I don't know what you're talking about. Let me know what the acronym is. What are the benefits of having a resident council? Some best practices, and we have some speakers that are going to come on at the end and talk to us. We have Connie Lasker, who is a board president, a resident council board president in North Little Rock. We're also going to have our moderator today, Charles, that's also going to speak about tenant organizing activities. We'll have a short Q&A, and then I'm also providing sources from a lot of the information that we're providing on this particular presentation. So let's get to it. Very first thing, most of your communities that we are working with our partners, and this training is specifically geared to our communities that have undergone a RAD conversion. So let's talk about what RAD is and what RAD basics. Everybody hears about it. There's a lot of misconceptions about what RAD is, but it's really, really easy. And so I've kind of distilled it down to a few slides so that we are all on the same page about what RAD is. So RAD is using the Rental Assistance Demonstration. That's what RAD stands for. And it's a program that is designed to preserve affordable housing and improve properties by converting them from the federal assistance of public housing operating funds and capital funds to the Section 8 program. So basically, RAD is converting one form of federal assistance and converting it into another form of federal assistance. Now, the Housing Authority can choose to convert it either to a project-based voucher program, which is called PBV, or the Housing Authority can choose to convert it to the project-based rental assistance, which is called PBRA. Both still do the same thing. They provide the subsidies to the residents. They preserve affordable housing. Conversion is voluntary. There are property improvements. So part of the conversion is that we are guaranteeing to HUD that the property will be improved, that there are items that will be addressed. There's usually a one-for-one replacement. There are some factors that sometimes allows us to reduce the units, and long-term preservation, which means that we enter into what's called a Hap Contract with the Housing Authority, usually between 15 to 20 years to preserve the units as affordable. And after that, the Hap contracts are also automatically extended. So for the lifetime of the project, the units remain affordable. Now, on the project-based voucher program and the project-based rental assistance program, there are two different things that happen. So the project-based voucher program is administered by the Housing Authority. So residents that are on the project-based voucher program, they will still work with their Housing Authority to have their subsidy. On the project-based rental assistance program, that goes through an ownership. It also goes through multifamily rather than PIH, which is public and Indian housing. So those are the two differences in the programs. Project-based rental assistance has a completely different HUD model lease. The PBV program works more on a private landlord lease. So there are some differences between the PBV program and the PBRA. For most of the projects that BGC Advantage and most of our partners that are on the call today, most of our projects are project-based voucher programs. Now, we are going to be getting into PBRA programs in the future, but as of right now, almost all of the conversions that BGC has done with our current partners has been the project-based voucher program. Under RAD, there are some basic rights that residents have. Some of the rights include that prior to conversion, residents have the right to receive notice, participate, and comment in resident meetings. During the conversion, the residents can continue to maintain residency at conversion. They also have temporary relocation protections that are provided, as well as what is called a right to return. After conversion, residents usually pay no more than 30% of their adjusted income in rent. They have the right to participate in resident organizations. They have the right to exercise choice mobility. The lease must be renewed and cannot be evicted without cause. And they have a right to termination and grievance procedures. So those are the basic resident rights. I also want to talk about some things that happened before RAD and after RAD, and why RAD is so important for us in the attempt to preserve affordable housing. So before RAD, properties are typically not funded at 100% in public housing. What that means is that public housing operating and capital expenditures are subject to congressional appropriations budgets. So usually before RAD, many of the housing authorities did not have the full amount to handle deferred maintenance, to handle all of the issues that usually were occurring at the housing authority. After RAD, properties are now placed on a more stable Section 8 funding platform, which means that the housing authority, the property can actually receive usually an increase in rents, higher rents, and it's not dependent so much on congressional appropriations, it's more dependent on what the fair market rents are in the area. Before RAD, public housing authorities could not borrow money to perform necessary repairs. After RAD, the housing authority and the owners can more easily borrow money and perform rehabilitation work. In addition to that, with the majority of the BGC projects, we then tend to do tax credit layering, home, bonds, so it gives us access to more capital to make much needed repairs. Before RAD, the funding fails to keep up with the deteriorating living conditions of residents. After RAD, the living conditions of residents usually are greatly improved, and that's because we've been able to address the majority of the issues that were happening with the housing. Before RAD, residents could not move without assistance, without losing their housing assistance. So think public housing. If you chose to move out of public housing, unless you received a housing choice voucher, you would actually lose your assistance. Now, after RAD, residents can receive what's called a tenant-based voucher under what we call choice mobility, or similar assistance, and move after 1 year in PBV or 2 years in PBRA. So after RAD, a resident that's been living in a RAD PBV community, they can actually exercise what they call choice mobility and take their voucher and move anywhere in the country that accepts a voucher. So those are the before and after RAD. Now let's talk about RAD tenant organizing rights before and after conversions. And throughout the presentation, I'll put down some of my sources. This particular source, which I thought was a really good source of information, is the National Housing Law Project. It's a great website. It's part of my sources. So if you have an opportunity and you have questions about not only tenant rights, about RAD, about organizing, about resident councils, National Housing Law Project has great information and great materials. So before RAD, residents had a right to organize and elect a resident council. I'll also notice that it says 24 CFR Part 964. Those are the Code of Federal Regulations. And so those are the sources in which we get all of the information that we'll be presenting. After RAD, well, guess what? Residents still have a right to organize and elect a resident organization to represent their interests. But this time, it could be either 24 CFR Part 245 or the HUD Notice 2012.32 Revision 3. Before RAD, resident councils could only include public housing residents, and they had to have written bylaws, describe elections, and recall procedures for democratically elected boards. After RAD, The owners are required to recognize legitimate tenant organizations that are established by the residents of the property, meet regularly, operate democratically, represent all residents at the property, and most importantly, are independent from the property owners. This also includes organizing committees newly formed by residents and does not require specific structures, written bylaws, election, or resident petitions. So there is a difference between the Public Housing Resident Council and now legitimate tenant organizations after RAD. We'll talk about best practices because I'm sure that everyone's going, what? We don't need bylaws, we don't need these things. Those are highly recommended. We encourage those, but the regulations are very specific that that is not needed at all. Before RAD, housing authorities were required to provide at least $25 per occupied unit per year for the resident participation activities. And the way that that was split is $15 would actually go to the resident organization or resident council to fund tenant participation activities. $10 would remain with the housing authority for administrative reasons. So $15 to the resident organization, $10 to the housing authority. That would make up the $25 of the occupied unit per year. After RAD, that has not gone away. The property owner must continue to provide resident participation funding in the amount of $25 for the occupied units. And again, the same split, $15 for resident participation and $10 for the property owner for administration. Before RAD, the housing authority and duly elected resident council had to enter. That's a must. So you'll notice in HUD language, we always say must or may. When we say must, that's regulatory. It must be done. When we say may, it means that the housing authority or the owner has discretion. They may do this, they may do that. But when it's a must, they have to do it. So prior to, there must have been a written agreement before the PHA could provide resident funding. Now, there does not have to be a written agreement after RAD. It's still strongly encouraged that the owner and duly elected resident council enter a written agreement before tenant participation funding is provided. And we'll talk a little bit about why this is important, but understand that regulation does not say that there has to be a written agreement. Now, part of what we'll talk about today as well is tenant organizers and canvassing. So we have tenant organizers and canvassing, but a lot of people are very confused about what a tenant organizer is. So a tenant organizer, it can be a tenant or it could be a non-tenant. It is definitely not a member of the management. It is not a member of the development team. Like I could not be a tenant organizer at any of our properties. So it is a tenant or a non-tenant. And tenant organizers assist tenants in establishing and operating a tenant organization. They're not an employee or representative of current or prospective owners, managers, or their agents. And they must operate independently. So they don't report to us, they don't do anything like that. Owners and management agents, we are required to allow tenant organizers to assist in establishing and operating a tenant organization. So there's no way that we could prevent any sort of tenant organization to happen or a tenant organizer to come onto our property. In some cases, some of the properties have what's called a non-canvassing policy. What that means is that tenant organizers must be accompanied by a tenant while on the property. On some of our properties we have that, and other properties we don't have that. If there is a non-canvassing policy, then non-tenant organizers can be given the same rights and privileges as other uninvited outside parties. Now, in addition to that, a tenant has a right not to be recanvassed against her wishes regarding participation in a tenant organization. So there are definite parameters as to what the management or the ownership can do, but one of the things that we cannot do is we cannot prevent tenant organizations and we cannot prevent any canvassing. The only person that has the right to do that is the tenant, has the right not to be recanvassed, and the tenants have the right to not only set up tenant organizations, but they can also work with outside tenant organizers. There are also protected activities. So these are specifically protected organizing activities that we as owner developers, as the housing authority, as the management agent cannot interfere with. They cannot do anything that interferes with any of the organizing activities. So owners must allow tenants and tenant organizers to conduct following activities: distribute leaflets in lobby areas and other common areas, place leaflets, brochures, information, flyers under tenant's door. We have to allow the tenant organizers to initiate contact with tenants, conduct door-to-door surveys to ascertain interest in establishing a tenant group and to offer information about tenant organizations, post information on bulletin boards, assist tenants to participate in tenant organization activities, hold regularly scheduled tenant meetings in a space on site without the attendance of management representatives, and develop responses to the owner's request for rental increases, conversion to tenant paid utilities, reducing the utility allowance, conversion to condos, or any sort of action that would impact the residents. So the one thing that we know is that we do not have to obtain the owner's or manager's position to do any of these things. These are things that tenants have the right to do. It is a protected right. They can work with organizers. They can work with various organizations. Most local communities usually have a tenant rights organization. Legal Aid is a great organization. There are attorneys that specialize in tenant organizations. So this is a protective activity that management cannot interfere with, the housing authority cannot interfere with, nor can the owner interfere with. So meeting spaces. So owners of covered multifamily properties must reasonably make space available in the community room, if any, or other space appropriate for tenant meetings. Tenant meetings have to be accessible to persons with disabilities unless it is impractical for reasons beyond organization's control. The owner may charge a fee as approved by HUD if it is normally imposed for the use of the space. The owner is not required to charge a fee. In BGC properties, we actually will not charge a fee for tenant organizing activities. This is part of what we support. We want residents to be able to organize. In BGC properties as well, many tenant organizations, the duly elected resident council actually has space. And so offices that are for resident councils are being preserved even during the rehab. And that is space that is utilized only for resident council. So an office for resident council, for example. And as owner developers and as management agents, we actually don't interfere with that space. That's not part of our space. We just make sure that it's maintained. But anything inside of that space, we would not have access to, with the exception of, performing work orders. So meeting space is also something that regulation-wise is encouraged for the owner to provide. And I say encourage, it's actually a requirement. So we want to make sure that everyone understands that as well. Now, there is a thing called interference with exercising your rights. So what usually will happen is that a manager or an overzealous manager will not know that this is something that is a right of a tenant. So very commonly, a manager will deny an accessible meeting space to residents. That would be considered interference with exercising of rights. So unreasonable denial of accessible meeting space to residents. Repeatedly sending management representatives to attend resident meetings when residents have requested management not to attend. And this is really important because as managers, they want to attend, they want to find out what's going on, but resident organizations, tenant organizations do not have to have a manager attend the meeting. Only when they are invited can a manager or an owner's representative or anyone attend the meeting, only when invited. So residents do not have to have managers there if they don't want to. They don't have to have owner representation there. And so once the residents have their organizing events or their resident councils, management cannot send anyone unless they are specifically invited. Evicting, threatening to evict, withholding entitlements, or otherwise penalizing residents for organizing or asserting their rights. That is actually also considered interference with exercising rights. Attempting to adversely influence resident leaders by offering individual inducements such as employment, preferential transfers, rent abatements, favored repairs, or other benefits not available to residents. Also considered interference with exercising your rights. And this is all part of the regulation. Attempting to form a competing resident organization under the control of the management company or the property owner, and running for office, or otherwise serving as a member of the resident organization. So all of these rights are actually protected of the resident organization. And so a management company, an owner, a developer, a housing authority can actually be interfering with the residents' rights if they attempt to do any of those things. So what can residents do? If a violation of your rights occur, well, HUD encourages property owners and residents to work together to determine the most appropriate ways. That sometimes works, that sometimes does not work. We understand that. BGC wants all of our residents to come and try to work through the management company, work through it, but we understand that there are times when that's not going to work. We get it. Residents are encouraged to contact the property owner directly with questions or concerns regarding issues related to their tenancy. That should always be your first line of defense. Property owners are also encouraged to actively engage residents in the absence of resident organizations. So at BGC, we have today Charles, who works as part of our resident liaison in our asset management department. And so we have a lot of communities that don't have resident organizations. So we do resident surveys. We go out, we make sure what are the residents wanting, what are they needing, because we want to encourage active participation by residents. But in the cases when there is a violation of rights, HUD does have a way for you to address it. The tenant or the tenant organization may file a complaint with evidence to the HUD field office. The HUD field office will then review and discuss with all parties. An FO on this slide means field office. So field office will determine if complaint is legitimate and enforcement required. If enforcement action is required, HUD sends notice of violations or default to owner. An enforcement action could be several things. For example, if I have a manager that continuously doesn't allow someone to meet, and the manager makes all sorts of reasons why they cannot use the community room, or they can't, the manager continuously is walking into the resident meetings. I've been in instances where managers have taken pictures of the residents and circulated those. I mean, there's lots of instances. Well, if there is enforcement action, HUD will actually outline what the enforcement action is. And the owner will have 30 days to respond or address the issue. If no response or issue not addressed, HUD will pursue further action. And so most time the owners, the developers, the agents, the housing authorities don't want to be in enforcement action with HUD. So they try to do right, but that doesn't always happen. But the residents do have a recourse if the violation of rights occur. And the recourse means involves HUD. Now there's also another part. We're going to talk about resident councils, but we've talked about tenant organizations, but what do tenant organizations do? Well, in most cases, they influence policy. You're trying to influence policy. You're trying to do something to better the quality of life on your community. You're trying to not only influence policy, but in most cases, you're trying to change policy. So there is what's called a RAB. It's called a Resident Advisory Board. Now in RAD PBV, which is what the majority of the BGC properties are, there is a PHA plan process that continues after conversion. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about this process because this is strictly for the housing authorities that have a project-based voucher program. They usually will also have a housing choice voucher program, and they usually converted from public housing. So every housing authority has to have what's called a public housing authority plan. It's usually an annual plan, and it's also a 5-year plan. Well, the housing authority, in order to get changes to their administrative plan, the administrative plan is what actually monitors and governs the housing choice voucher program. They require housing authority board approval. Every administrative plan, if there is a project-based voucher program, also has PBV policies in the administrative plan. So the housing authority must approve the operating budget. They have to approve the changes to the admin plan, and admin plan is just short for administrative plan. They have to approve the changes to any policies. And so because the project-based voucher residents are actually still part of this administrative plan program, then the voucher residents are actually eligible to serve on the RAB. The Resident Advisory Board is not the resident council. The Resident Advisory Board is not a tenant organizing committee. The Resident Advisory Board are just residents that are either selected by the Housing Authority, they're invited to participate by the Housing Authority, the resident can volunteer to participate. And so some housing authorities have very formal RABs, other housing authorities form RABs during the annual planning process. And those residents that are on the project-based voucher program can serve on the RAB. So this is the Resident Advisory Board. This is strictly to make comments on policies and procedures, to influence policy, and to help the Housing Authority make changes and provide comments to HUD during the annual plan or the 5-year planning process. So housing authorities are encouraged to also include PBV residents, not just Housing Choice Voucher residents, but also PBV residents. The public housing residents previously were able to comment on what's called the ACOP, the Annual Continued Occupancy Policy. The Annual Continued Occupancy Policy, or ACOP as we call it, was actually the policies that govern the public housing program. Once housing authorities convert under RAD and they no longer have public housing, then that ACOP does go away. And so that is why now the administrative plan for PBV clients, project-based voucher clients, is what actually would govern. Now, let's switch from project-based voucher to now what we call project-based rental assistance. That's PBRA. PBRA does not fall under the housing authority. So if you're a resident who is participating in the PBRA multifamily program, then you have nothing to comment on the PHA plan process because this is strictly HUD multifamily. The subsidy comes straight from HUD, and there's no involvement with the housing authority. In PBRA, residents also cannot be resident commissioners of the housing authority. So in the PBV program, HCV program, public housing program, residents are encouraged to serve on the Board of Commissioners, and residents are encouraged to serve as resident commissioners. On the PBRA program, resident commissioners, you cannot be a resident commissioner. It doesn't mean that you as a city person or as a citizen of your city are not allowed to serve on the Housing Authority Board. We encourage that as well, but you just would not fulfill the title of a resident commissioner. And you also do have the right to notice and comment just like the general public does on the PBRA side. So that's very different from what resident councils do and what tenant organizations do. The RAB is separate entity, and its function is to strictly comment on PHA plans and approvals and annual plan and 5-year plan. So it's just a little bit different. Resident councils, however, are actually my favorite, especially when we have really great resident councils on some sites, because resident councils make management of the site so much easier because they are in constant communication with all of the residents, and they just provide a certain level of accountability to the management company, to the developer, to the housing authority. But resident councils usually are able to tap into that resident energy and really make things happen for the community. So allowable activities for resident councils: consultation and outreach efforts that support active interaction between the housing authority and residents. Activities that inform residents on issues in our operations that affect resident households and their living environment. They can do resident surveys to collect resident input. Annual membership events on site, community activities that enhance resident participation. Resident councils also can do resident commissioner training, resident council training, resident activity board training, resident advisory board training, which is the RAB, leadership development, household training, orientation, and training for new and existing residents on resident responsibilities, resident council elections and organizing, planning functions such as matters such as the Public Housing Agency Plan, revitalization, safety and security, property management and maintenance, and capital improvements. They're also allowed to use tenant participation funds for reasonable refreshment and light snack costs that are directly related to resident meetings for the activities discussed in this section. And one of the things that resident councils can have is stipends to resident council officers who serve as volunteers in their public housing communities. So there's a lot of things that resident councils can do. We'll talk a little bit more about what resident councils can do, but there's some very clear, distinct things. Resident councils can definitely be tenant organizers and organize residents around certain issues, but resident councils tend to be more global. They tend to work for the benefit of all the residents, and they're not always organized around one particular issue. Sometimes your tenant organizations may be different from your resident councils. They're both encouraged. Usually the housing authority or the owner will only recognize one duly elected resident council. And when there is a dispute, then that would have to be taken to HUD to sort out. Additional allowable residents or resident councils are things as social support, self-sufficiency, and youth initiatives. In particular, we have senior sites, we have family sites. Depending on the type of site that you have, there'll be different activities. Coordination of supportive services. So I've worked with resident councils that were responsible for not only bringing supportive services to the sites, but also vetting of the supportive services and what was actually needed. Training of residents for programs such as childcare, early childhood development, parent, all sorts of job training programs. We also are very pro Section 3, which is something that can help resident business concerns. And so sometimes resident councils that we've worked with in the past have brought job training programs to the sites. We've had resident councils who have ran businesses off of the site that, was allowed by the site, things like, small convenience stores, cafes. I've seen a lot of resident council receive awards for things like candle making, arts and crafts, art shows, running a craft type business. So those are all things that you can actually do as a resident council, and not only do, but also enhance the quality of the program. Volunteer services. Resident councils often use volunteers. And so I've had senior high rises where resident council members usually have worked the front desk during the day, signed people in, and this was in conjunction with our security services. Parenting skills, before and after school programs, senior programs, training programs on health, nutrition, and safety, child abuse and neglect prevention, tutorial services. We've had one property in which it was what we call a continuum of care property, where not only did we have a family site, but we also had a senior site. And the seniors from the senior site would go to the family site community room to help with the before and after school programs, but also to do a reading program for children. They did crafts with the children. All of these things usually are done independent of the management company, but they are actually done by the resident councils because the resident councils want to bring these services. The management company or the owner, the developer, we would provide space. In a lot of cases, we would provide supplies. In certain cases, we would help with grant funding. But all of these are initiated by the residents. And what we find normally is that resident-initiated initiatives usually are a lot more successful than management initiatives. Also, one of the things that resident councils have done is they partner with community organizations, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA, YWCA, Boy and Girl Scouts, Campfire, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, a lot of faith-based organizations. So that is something that resident councils not only do, but we encourage them to do that to bring additional supportive services. We've had some resident councils that have literally used common space. We've allowed them to actually manage all of the common spaces. So on a lot of our properties, because they tend to be reconverted public housing communities, past public housing communities usually had multi-purpose centers. They had chapels, they had all sorts of offices, all sorts of things where, as a management company, we're just using one office usually. And so the resident councils have taken on the community space rental arrangements, and they make sure that people are using those. So things like, I know one of my properties in North Little Rock has an arts and crafts room. We have chapels in some of them. In some of them, we have actual multi-purpose centers with gyms and basketball courts and all sorts of things. So resident councils, because they want to use these spaces for the benefit of the residents, for all of the residents, then we go ahead and allow them to, by written agreement, obviously, because there are liability issues, we allow them to take over those spaces in partnership with whoever they want to bring in. Youth education, sports program, drug use and violence prevention programs, financial literacy and credit counseling. I mean, all of these are allowable activities, and I could go on and on and on and on. There are some things that are not allowable, which is basically you cannot purchase alcohol with resident council funds. So that's one of those obvious things. But in most cases, pretty much most everything that the resident council wants to do that support initiatives for self-sufficiency, social support needs, those are usually allowable activities. And so once you start organizing as a resident council and once you start doing surveys, and if you already have a resident council that is doing activities, then you just want to make sure that those activities are not only being tracked, that you're getting enough support to do them, but that you're maximizing the participation in those activities. Additional programs and activities. So one of the biggest things that I know just from working in so many communities is there's always strength in numbers. A resident organization can be a catalyst to great things, including healthy working relationships among residents, management, and the broader community. What we find on the development and the management side is when we have a really good resident council, a robust resident council that not only works with management and holds management accountable, because working with management does not mean you agree with everything management is doing. It means that you're holding management accountable, but you're also holding residents accountable, that residents are empowered to actually make changes that they feel will better their community. So it's not just, management is actually the weaker of the two when you're talking about residents and management. And so resident organizations that are united, that are strong, they have a lot of power. Some of the things that I've seen resident organizations do as well is community gardens. Now, everybody on my team knows that I just cannot stand community gardens because I don't want to be out there doing them. But some community gardens are very successful, and they're successful because residents take them on. On-site childcare has been a program that I've been very impressed by. Neighborhood watches, that's probably the most significant that we have with resident organizations, in particular when resident organizations work with their local law enforcement. Organizing on-site sports tournament, establishing teens clubs. One of the neat things that I saw was operating a food bank out of one of our properties. This particular property in Florida had a really neat food bank that was completely run by residents. Food was sorted by residents, and they partnered with the local food bank in order to actually bring these services to the site. The fun things are the social activities. Usually most resident councils actually do social activities, and that's a part of actually living in a community, being part of the community. Vending machine contracts. A lot of residents want to generate revenue in addition to the tenant participation funds. And so they work with the management company in order to say, if we bring these vending machines or these laundry room contracts or, these little convenience store contracts, can we generate the revenue and put it back into our resident council? So those are additional income streams for the resident council. The possibilities are really open. Additional services to your community, manage concern community spaces. So one of our resident councils, and this particular one was in Dallas, where we would actually allow the resident council to rent out the community space to their other residents, for private events, not for organizing activities or not for resident council activities. But for example, if I wanted to have a birthday party in a community room, the resident council was responsible not only for scheduling the birthday party, but also making sure that there was coverage during the birthday party and that the community space was cleaned up after the birthday party. And then they would charge a very nominal fee to the resident, but they would actually make that money from that. So that was one of those approved items that a resident council was able to negotiate with the housing authority. Resident council members and organizers also attend industry training representing your community. So I've been to many industry conferences, obviously pre-COVID. They included things like National NARA, which is National Association of Housing Redevelopment Officials, Texas Housing Association. There's a lot of local regional conferences. And residents are actually encouraged to attend those. And so residents will use tenant participation funds to actually send their representation to industry conferences to learn more about not only the programs, because if you're in a leadership position as an organizer, as a resident council leader, and even as a resident that wants to be informed, then it really does fall on you to be responsible enough to learn about the programs at your community, because that makes you stronger. Manage community stores, assist in resident businesses, and so much more. So there's a lot of things that residents can actually do as part of organizing. We talked about influencing policy. We talked about serving on the Resident Advisory Board. We talked about organizing, establishing, and participating in resident council activities. So those are 3 avenues by which residents can continue to be active even post-Rad conversion. So prior to Rad, you had certain parameters. After Rad, in most cases, the residents still retain the exact same rights, but they fall under a different reporting under a regulation. But in most cases, none of the rights have been taken away. In order for these projects to continue to be successful, it's so important that we continue with resident activities and resident organizations and resident organizing activities. So success. What does success look like? Well, one of the things that we have found when we work with resident organizations is that for a successful resident organization, you have to be unified in a common purpose. A lot of resident organizing committees will just be unified against, 1 or 2 things, but they're only taking into account that they're only representing 1 or 2 residents. And so residents have to be unified in a common purpose. Active, cooperative, and enthusiastic leaders. Usually the leaders that we see that are very successful in resident organizations, they want to see change. More importantly, they believe that change can happen and they're willing to work towards that change. Good organization with an emphasis on completion of projects. So in certain cases, we see resident organizations that are loosely organized, and we can't help them become organized. They must become organized on their own. We can provide training. This is one of the avenues by which we can do that. We can also provide technical training on the regulations. We can send you to different classes. We can show you how some resident organizations do bylaws, do written policies and procedures. The larger your organization, the more policy and procedure you're going to want your organization to have, although we would not require it, but you should require it in order to be able to be successful. Accountability for all funds. The worst things that I've ever seen with resident councils and tenant organizing events is when the leaders of the tenant organization receive the tenant participation funds and no one can account for those funds. It lends to some sort of non-credibility with the resident organization. But again, we as owners, developers, public housing agencies, we cannot become involved. That has to be strictly with the resident organization. And then avoiding conflicts of interest and personality feuds. That's usually why we see resident organizations ebb and flow, in particular in resident councils. Especially when there is a representative resident council and someone else decides that they want to be the resident council, well, they really should work between the legitimate, recognized resident council. So one of the questions that I noticed on the chat line is, can resident council be per development site or one for the entire development? You can break up resident councils the way that you want to. So if I've had resident councils where there's a larger organization resident council that might be called the Council of Presidents. And so in each of those resident councils, they have a resident council specific to a site, and then all of those resident councils, meet together for the larger community. So that's one of the things that you can do. Another question that was asked on the chat was, do resident council stipends apply only to public housing? Council members, does it apply to PBV as well? That's a great question. So if the resident council chooses to pay themselves stipends from the TPV funds, from the tenant participation funds, then the resident council can pay themselves stipends. Stipends that are not tenant participation funds only apply to public housing. That doesn't mean that an owner can't decide to pay a stipend that's outside of the resident council, but resident councils normally are using their tenant participation funds to pay themselves stipends. So before in public housing, it wasn't part of the tenant participation funds. After RAD, it's part of the tenant participation funds. Another question was asked is, how do you get on a RAB advisory board specifically? Every housing authority is different, so you would have to contact your housing authority. Some housing authorities have a standing resident advisory board. Some housing authorities work directly with resident council and use the resident council as the resident advisory board. Some housing authorities might use their family self-sufficiency residents as the resident advisory board. Others just ask people, would you like to be on the resident advisory board for this policy, and will you make a commitment for the next 3 or 4 months to review policies, attend public hearings, and make comments? So every housing authority has a different way of working with a resident advisory board, but every housing authority is required to have a resident advisory board. But there's nothing regulatory wise that says that they have to be elected, that they have to be a certain way. Every housing authority will have a different resident advisory board participation way. The price of success, and I love this quote, it's Frank Lloyd Wright, is dedication, hard work, and an unremitting devotion to the things you want to see happen. And that's really, really true, because sometimes, you know, resident councils, they tend to ebb and flow, ebb and flow. And for it to be a strong resident council, you have to have committed leadership. You have to have committed leadership to the process and also working with the players. And the only difference between success and failure is the ability to take action. That's Alexander Graham Bell. So, who wins? Who wins with tenant organizations? A lot of times, managers don't like tenant organizations. They don't want the resident council. Developers sometimes also feel like, you know, we don't want resident councils, we don't want tenant organizations. But the truth of the matter is, everyone wins when there's a strong resident organizing organization. The resident benefits is enhanced mutual support, increased sense of community, decreased isolation, new experiences and relationships. There's a shared responsibility, pride, and joy of accomplishment. And that's really important, especially when we go through these RAD transitions and people start seeing the before and the after. For residents, there's a development of skills, especially leadership skills. And one of the things that we encourage residents is to make sure that they understand they're part of the larger community. Not only are they part of the housing community, but they're also part of the city, and they can impact change at the city level. They can impact change at the state level. They can impact change on the housing level. You know, there's a lot of housing lobbyist organizations. As residents become a little bit more knowledgeable, a little bit more informed, it's so important that these same residents that are participating in resident organizations and organizing events and resident councils, that they also contribute to the larger conversation of housing. Because affordable housing is one of those things that's usually placed on the back burner. And affordable housing is something that we're really passionate about. Development of skills, especially leaderships, and delivery of new services, activities, and opportunities. So those are resident benefits. But also, that's not listed here is just policy change. A lot of times, management policies, development policies, they are not to the benefit of residents. And so who better to talk about what the benefit is than residents? For us as managers and developers and as owners, there are benefits to having a great, strong resident organization. Enhanced job satisfaction for the people that work on the site. I've been a property manager for many, many, many years. I was on site, I worked with residents, and I can tell you, residents that are happy, that are working with managers, that are getting what they need out of the relationship, make our job so much easier, and there's a joy in a manager when they are able to come to work and actually make an impact on residents' lives. I think that's why many of us at BGC continue to work in affordable housing. Better, more satisfying relationships with residents. This one's my favorite: reduction of resident complaints. Sometimes all we deal with is resident complaints, but residents that are working strongly with the management, they do help in maintaining a positive image for the property. And they also provide support in resolving property problems. Creation of an orderly communication channel between management and residents. So those are all of the benefits that you have when you're talking about a resident participation in resident council and tenant organizing activities. And so the one thing that I try to make sure that everyone usually understands is that the residents are not the bad guys. And this goes to the housing authorities, this goes to the management. The residents are not the bad guys. But also the residents should understand that the management, the housing authorities are not the bad guys either. And so we all have to work together in order to enhance the quality of lives for the residents, because they live there, that's their homes. But we also work here and we want to do a good job. And so a lot of what we do is we try to educate, advocate, make sure that residents get everything that they need in order for them to be able to get what they need in order to successfully live and enjoy their homes. I do have someone that I want to introduce to you. Today, I'm going to turn over the presentation to you because I wanted you to say a few words about resident advocacy, and then I think that you were going to introduce Ms. Lasker. Is that correct today?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to put myself on mute today.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Today Charles. I am the Asset Manager of Operations with BGC Advantage, and as it pertains to resident advocacy and activities, I advocate all day, every day. It's very important for all parties to understand that the residents are our focal point. If we don't have our residents, we wouldn't have a job. So it's very important to listen. It's very important to listen to understand, not so much to listen to reply. You're wanting to take out time to really understand where they're coming from. And then from the residents, it's very important to make sure that you're clear on your request, because you don't want management to assume that they understand what you're meaning. And so you don't want to get frustrated. With that being said, there's a lot of activities that go on. We take out the time to do more than what is required. And we do that because we really do enjoy making sure that our residents' home is a home, you know, versus just going to a building. That is very important to us. Our residents mean a lot to us. And so when we enter into management agreements, we make sure that the management companies understand that residents are a priority. Now, this is not to be said to take advantage of and to go to the point to where there's favoritism or going above and beyond, because we want to be mindful of fair housing. We want to make sure that what we do for one, we do for all. So with that being said, we want to make sure that we always communicate effectively. Active listening skills is very important. So the resident management company is not case managers. I have a lot of residents that are on here today that I tell them to call me, to utilize me. We do what we can to get connected to resources. If we have a third-party entity that provides connections to other resources and advocate for the community, we will do what it takes to ensure that mentally, emotionally, and that all residents are living in a safe, decent, and affordable housing. That is very important. We take away from the stigma, right, of public housing. This is your home. This is not just another affordable housing. This is your home. This is where you want to bring your grandchildren and your family and to have a wonderful time. So it's very important to create that safe environment. Because if a safe environment is not created, then you have a dysfunctional environment, and that's what we don't want to have. So together, collectively, we make sure that all voices are heard and we listen to understand, not listen to respond. With that being said, JoAnn, if you can come off of mute for a second, I had a couple of private questions that were directly to me, and I want to make sure we address them before I introduce Ms. Lasker.
Okay, I'm off mute today.
One was in reference to a handbook. Someone's asking for a copy of a handbook. I'm wondering if they mean the PowerPoint, or did you speak to a handbook in specifically?
I did not speak to a handbook. There are several resident handbooks that are online. HUD has great resources. Let me go to the next slide so I can show you some of the sources. So HUD does have some great resources, but also there's a lot of housing authorities that have taken the time with consultants to create handbooks. Minnesota Housing Authority is one of the handbooks that I tend to go to because it has great forms and things like that. And so if a person wants to reach out specifically to me about technical guidance on how to establish a resident council or how to formulate more information for their resident council, I'd be more than happy to share their resources. I tend to go to the HUD website, and then what I tend to do, especially for trainings like this or when I run up against a problem, I tend to go online and just look up resident organizations. You know, I reside in Texas, so I use Texas Tenant Union. They've got some great resources for organizing. I know in Arkansas, there's Arkansas Renters United. Missouri, there's different groups. So you want to look at the tenant organizations that you have locally. Legal Aid is also a great resource for organizing activities. But if you're specifically looking for resident council handbooks, just go online. There's some great resources online, but I can also send you some resources. I have binders of resources just on resident organizations that I've worked with in the past, but also on updated resident information.
Awesome, thank you very much. The second question is, I believe it is to be understood that we're asking if two people can office out of the same office, RAD and a president council. But I think what they probably mean is a community resident advocate and president council.
Okay, so resident council meeting spaces, office spaces, are very specific to the duly elected and recognized resident council. So they would not, they would actually not, so let me just make clear. RAB is the Resident Advisory Board. Resident advisory boards normally don't have office spaces. They usually work in conjunction with the housing authority in the formulation and the commenting and the processing of the annual plan. So resident advisory board could literally be you serve on it for 3 or 4 months during the annual plan processing, and then that's it. That's usually just your commitment. So resident advisory boards don't normally have office spaces. It doesn't mean that you can't have an office space. It just means that that's not a requirement, that's not provided, that's not addressed in the regulations. Resident councils and tenant organizers have a right to be able to go on site and utilize the meeting spaces. So that is a right. Now, in the majority of our properties, resident councils have offices, very different from the right of being able to use a meeting space. So if a resident council has an office on the site, the resident council does not have to share that office with management, with any other organization. That office is specifically limited to resident council, the resident council officers, whoever the resident council is on that site. I, as management or the housing authority, we don't have access to that office with the exception of emergency entrance for work orders. Everything in that office belongs to the resident council. So if there's computers, if there's printers, a lot of times housing authorities will provide that or owners will provide that, but that's also not a requirement. So the resident council offices are limited to resident council. I hope that that answered was a little bit more clear.
Yeah, that was a little more clear. And then the last question is, how do tenants request more specifics on helping understanding what the next steps are for tenant council creations?
Well, one of the next steps for tenant council, for resident council, so if you want to create a resident council, You have to organize the residents. You've got to have an election because you have to have an elected board. You don't necessarily in Post-Rad have to have written bylaws or anything like that. If there's already a resident council in place, then you just kind of want to run for election there. But if there is not a resident council in place, then you can go to the resident council regulations that are provided here. As long as you have an elected meeting, and let me go back to the slide. Let me see if I can go back to the slide of what is a legitimate tenant organization, okay? So here is what you would have to do to set yourself up as a legitimate tenant organization. I'm not sure if everyone can see that. Today, do you see that? The legitimate tenant organization? Okay. You have to establish by the residents of the property, meet regularly, operate democratically. What that normally means is that you have an election that, you know, it doesn't mean that today and I live next door to each other and we decide we're going to be the legitimate tenant organization, but we don't let anyone know. No one has elected us and then we're meeting every day for lunch. That's not what that means. What that means is that you usually are going out, meeting with residents, getting residents to say that this is the resident organization, electing a resident council or a president or someone, and representing all residents in the property. You do this independent from us. In certain cases, you know, you have to have elections every 3 years, and you can default back to the public housing regulations on how to really set that up. But post-RAD, there's not a lot of guidance specifically on what needs to happen. We just kind of tend to go back to the public housing regulations to try to understand how the resident organization should meet and should operate. But again, there's no requirement that you have written bylaws. There's no requirement that you enter an agreement with the owners, but we do like to see that in particular to make your organization stronger.
Thank you very much. And then I just want to reiterate, I see we have more questions as it pertains to the recording. We will definitely make the recording available, whether it be on the website or I myself will take out time to email it once we do receive it, okay? With that being said, one more thing that I wanted to add as we continue to communicate with our residents and the community is this is to all of the residents. This is your community. This is your home. If there are any resources or connections that you may have and you want to have someone advocate for the community to see what kind of services they could provide so that we may enter into an MOU, feel free to send them my way. I do not have a problem when it comes to advocating for the betterment of the community and the residents, whatever that may be, only because you may not have the resources or you may not be a great speaker or you just simply don't want to do it and you want to just pass it off and like, Miss Today, can you do this for me? Absolutely, I sure will, okay? With that being said, I want to take this time to introduce Ms. Lasker. She is our President Resident Council in North Little Rock, and she's going to speak to everyone for a minute. I thank you. Connie, are you able to come off? Let me see.
They pay utilities when we get to family side. They pay utilities. What
Can everyone hear me?
I'll stand in the back.
Connie, I just need to identify you. I'm going to mute everyone and then I'll unmute you individually, okay?
First they have.
Okay.
Okay, Connie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone. Thank you today. Thank you, JoAnn, for giving me this opportunity to speak. I've been the president of the North Little Rock Resident Council for the last year and a half, and it has been rewarding, and it's also been very, very challenging. I'm so glad and thankful that JoAnn and today was able to have this training because we coming from, this is post-RAD for us, so we've been used to operating under the North Little Rock housing, and it has been different. And so there has been a lot of different conflicts and a lot of different personalities, personality feuds. But I just want to say, this is our community. We all live here. We don't just stay here. So if you think about if you've ever owned a home, or as you was growing up, everyone in the home, you didn't get along with everyone. And so if you look at it like we're family, we're going to fight sometime, but at the end of the day, if you have kindness and love for your fellow person, there is a solution. You just got to find it, but it's always there. And I like the fact that with BGC, they are the real deal. I mean, they are not, to me, the traditional management. They really do care. They really are working with us. And there are many problems and challenges. But when we reach out and we communicate, we are always stronger. We're more unified. As a resident council president, we do have a lot of events. We're trying to do something more often on a regular, even though there's COVID, which they're going to be having and have had. We partnered with the faith-based organization of churches. They're providing wonderful lunches and dinners for us. We're able to go in and do some wealth management, some training on some credit counseling. We're going to be having some virtual bingo. We're going to still be having Zoom meetings. We have a wonderful board that we work with. I just want to encourage everyone. This has been a very challenging year since COVID, the pandemic. A lot of people have lost a lot of loved ones. You never know what your neighbors is going through. I know myself personally, I have children. I can't even imagine losing one. But on my floor personally, we've had people lose their children. So just think about your neighbors and be family. You never know what someone else is going through. And even though this last week we had a lot of storm, we have a lot of people without power, without water, I just want to encourage everyone to just, even though we have policies and procedures and managers, think about unity. Think about the love of Jesus and just try to have faith and love for one another. And I think we're going to be okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Lasker. One of the things, Ms. Lasker, that a lot of residents are interested in finding out is how to set up a resident council. And I know that you've gone and spoken to several different councils on how to get started. Could you address that?
Yes, I've actually done a lot of the things that you have done. I researched, I Googled the National House of Law Project. I think you mentioned them early on. I actually called them a couple years ago. They actually sent me the Green Book on fair housing, which is kind of a very expensive book, but you can call them or write them, and sometimes they'll have books that they have left over from the year before, and they'll send that. That's a good way I did to try to learn a lot of the things that I don't know, that we don't know, that'll help. And they have a lot of online Googling on how to set up a resident council. There's a lot of information out there. If you just Google how to set up a resident council, there's a lot of, like you mentioned, the Minnesota handbook. There's a lot of handbooks out there. Also, you can call me. And I've been working with a lot of local organizations, about 4 right now, sites, trying to help them get set up with the bylaws and things like that. So, yeah, just Google, call us. As you mentioned, you can have 2. It's really, it's a little time consuming, but it's not that difficult.
Thank you, Ms. Lasker. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And so what we find is usually other resident organizations tend to help resident councils get set up. You know, we can also provide technical assistance on the BGC side with just providing information, but we can actually, you know, send you resources and also put you in touch with other resident council organizations. But you also want to work with your local tenant organizers. I did include the sources on this presentation, and I also included on this particular presentation, so that everyone that got the slides, I just included the the actual regulations. So even though we're not going to go over each of these slides, you'll notice that as part of the slide presentation, I actually included all of the regulations. This is part of a larger presentation that usually takes about 4 hours, but this was just one of those presentations that we wanted to get out there and talk with residents. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask besides in the chat line? Are there any comments that need to be made? Anything that you'd like to be able to express? We can open the floor up. If you're asking a question, should you unmute yourself?
Currently, JoAnn, everyone's muted. So.
Okay.
Do you
Well,
want me to-
they have the ability to unmute themselves even though they're muted.
I believe there's a question in the chat from Ms. Bobby Head.
Okay, let me look at the chat real quick. If there is no official RAB pre-conversion, is there one post-RAB conversion? So every housing authority has a resident advisory board. You can find that information usually in the annual plan. It may not have been advertised or, really been made a big deal, because really the resident advisory board usually is, if there's a resident council at your particular housing authority, they might have used that. There's different ways of getting to the RAB. So the resident advisory board, remember, is to go over the annual plan and the administrative plan. So every year when the housing authority updates the administrative plan through the annual plan process, they get comments from what's called the RAB. Usually it could be even the public hearing process. So if people that show up to the public hearing and they put in comments to the RAB, then that's something that's included. I know there's some chat, but that's kind of more specific to one project, and Ms. Lasker has offered her contact information, so we will provide that contact information. We can send it out. Today, can you make sure that you send out the contact information for Ms. Lasker? Okay. So that addresses the last question. Are there any other questions? I hope this has been beneficial. We really wanted to focus in on the rights and what a management company should and shouldn't do in reference to resident rights. We also wanted to make sure that residents understood that, we want to encourage participation by residents. We want to encourage residents to organize and to actively unify for common purposes for the betterment of the community. We believe that that's important, but we also want to establish boundaries and parameters by which we communicate and channel how we can actually get things accomplished.
JoAnn?
Yes.
Hi, this is Taronda Bethune from the Daytona Beach Housing Authority. May I ask a question, please?
You certainly can. Hi, Taronda.
Hi. Is the availability to look at your slides going to be available to us? Because like some of the CFRs, I would like to be able to reference those with questions from the residents as they have them.
Yep, we can post the slides on BGC's website, but we also have sent it out to everyone on this call. So if you did not receive it, make sure that you email myself or today and we'll get the slides out to you. But yes.
Thank you.
If you actually go into the meeting invite and open it up, it's an attachment. So if you didn't receive the attachment, then definitely send us an email. But it's in the attachment in the invite.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Any other questions? So we do have a question saying if they want to be part of the RAB and offer volunteer, does the Housing Authority have to approve tenants before they can participate? That really is up to the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority can select who they want to participate on the RAB, and so that really is up to the Housing Authority. However, you can participate in the public comment section with the through the annual planning process, because the Housing Authority is required to post when they're doing their annual plan public hearing. So residents have multiple opportunities to comment on the PHA plan. Remember, the RAB is for the PHA plan. I want to make sure that everybody understands that. Resident Advisory Board is for the PHA plan. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everyone for participating. We are going to be continuing to offer additional classes. If you have any requests, technical requests, you can go on to our BGC website. Our BGC website allows you to request training. Usually these shorter sessions we provide complimentary to our partners and those who want to attend. But as I said earlier, BGC is dedicated to not only working with our residents and our management partners and our PHA partners, but usually we have a trainer for pretty much every single topic. So if you are interested in training, we'll be doing this again, actually same time next month. And so we'll send out information on the topic then. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed the training and that you found it beneficial. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing what else we can do for you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.